August 19th, 1944, Wolfschanze, East Prussia. Rain tapped against the bunker roof as General Oberst Alfred Jodl bent over a map of France. He didn't bother with preamble. 400 miles from Normandy to Patton, he said, tracing the red pencil line eastward. No army sustains that. A kerosene lamp hissed beside him. The paper was damp from the air. The ink smudged where he'd already made notes: fuel, tonnage, distances. Behind him, a field phone rang once and stopped. The war outside the concrete walls had narrowed to arithmetic. Third Army's spearhead has outrun its supply, he told his aide, Major Gerlach. Their depots are still near the beaches. They can't keep pace with their own armor. Gerlach studied the figures. 12 divisions, 60-mile front. Fuel use? 150,000 gallons per armored division. Per day, Jodl replied. They move faster than fuel can follow. The panzers learned that in Russia, he had been there. The endless steppe, trucks frozen in ruts, horses collapsing in the mud. Blitzkrieg had always died of starvation, not bullets. And now, by all logic, the Americans were racing toward the same end. He marked the Seine with a single slash. They'll stop here, he said. Distance is the enemy's ally until it becomes his killer. Reports from the front arrived by teleprinter. Bridges demolished, rail lines cut, fuel dumps lost. Everything pointed to exhaustion on the Allied side. 2 days, he said. Maybe 3. Then they pause. When they do, we hit them. The order went out before midnight. Army Group B to regroup along the Seine. Reserve armor to hold ground until autumn rains arrived. Jodl folded the map, satisfied. Physical laws cannot be violated, he told Gerlach, not even by America. But the numbers he trusted were already obsolete. 120 miles to the west, thousands of trucks were assembling in the dark, headlights uncovered, engines idling in rows. Mechanics shouted over the roar as dispatchers marked routes in chalk across windshields. Saint-Lô to Chartres, Chartres to the Seine. There were no manuals, no precedent, no pause. They would run day and night, one way for supplies, one way for empties, a human conveyor belt across France. The officers who designed it didn't name it after a strategy or a general. They borrowed a railroad term for speed and priority. The Red Ball Express had just begun, and Jodl's law of limits was about to break. Jodl's forecast spread through Oberkommando West on August 20th, 1944. His figures, fuel consumption, distance, tonnage, were copied into new summaries from General Major Siegfried Westphal, Chief of Staff, to Field Marshal von Rundstedt. Westphal's memo read, even with unlimited trucks and perfect roads, they could not advance beyond 48 hours. Physical laws cannot be violated. Every German staff officer agreed. On the Channel coast, the opposite calculation was already being tested. Lieutenant Colonel Lorin Ayres of the Motor Transport Service met his officers in a requisitioned hall outside Le Mans on August 25th. Supply maps showed wrecked rail lines and jammed convoys stretching back to Cherbourg. Patton's Third Army was burning through 12,000 tons of fuel and ammunition each day. "Gentlemen," Ayres said, tapping a red line across the map, "we're making a one-way road. South for loads, north for empties. 20 hours a day. No stops." That afternoon, the plan reached Colonel Charles O. Thrasher, commander of the advance section, Com Z. He calculated the requirement: 140 truck companies, 5,958 vehicles, 90% serviceable. "Impossible by any textbook," he scribbled, then approved it. Within 36 hours, convoys began forming at Saint-Lô. The insignia came from rail jargon: Red Ball freight meant express priority. The same rule would govern the new road. No delays, no diversions. August 26th. The 3,916th Quartermaster Truck Company rolled out in GMC-CCKW 2.5-ton trucks, the deuce and a half. Each carried 5 tons of artillery shells bound for Melun, 300 miles east. Orders were precise. Drive 35 miles per hour, maintain 300-yard spacing, halt only for fuel or breakdowns. 75% of the drivers were African American, serving in segregated units. Private Samuel Collins, 19, from Detroit, painted Detroit to Berlin Express on his bumper before climbing in. By nightfall, Route N24B had become a line of white light. Military police directed flow every 5 miles. Breakdowns were shoved into ditches for later repair. No blackout, no dispersion, just motion. The rule was simple. Below 25 miles per hour, you left the road. German observers near Le Mans saw it first. A report from Aufklärungsabteilung 116, dated August 28th, described continuous columns, headlights visible for 20 kilometers, approximately 1,000 vehicles per hour. It defied every principle of concealment. 2 days later, General Lieutenant Edgar Feuchtinger of the 21st Panzer Division watched from a ridge near Argenton. His report to Army Group B read, "Vehicles pass at 30-second intervals, day and night, without pause. They do not hide. They follow no rule we understand." Between August 25th and 31st, tonnage records confirmed what he'd seen. 89,939 tons delivered, averaging 12,848 per day. Round-trip distance, 686 miles. Each truck averaged 1.5 trips daily. The convoys themselves burned 300,000 gallons of gasoline per day. September 1st. Patton's 4th Armored Division advanced 35 miles by noon, halted for fuel, then drove another 32 before nightfall. 67 miles in 1 day. German intelligence dismissed the number until intercepts confirmed it. No armored force can advance 60 miles daily, one staff note read. Mechanical limits forbid it. General Heinz Guderian in East Prussia refused to believe the reports. Propaganda, he said. Yet radio logs showed American fuel dumps refilling faster than German columns could retreat. At OKW, planners still expected Patton to halt within 48 hours. On the ground, 5,958 trucks were proving otherwise, hauling 12,000 tons every day across roads the Luftwaffe had cratered months earlier. The arithmetic written in Jodel's bunker had dissolved under wheels on French asphalt. What German analysts saw as violation of physics was, in fact, a new equation entirely: massed engines, planned redundancy, and drivers who did not stop. Within a week, the trucks would push Patton's front beyond every German estimate. What they didn't yet understand was that this improvised road, lit end to end across France, had already rewritten the laws they thought unbreakable. The convoy system that took shape in early September was unlike anything the world had seen. It was not a supply line. It was an organism. From Cherbourg to Chartres, 5,000 engines throbbed in unison, their rhythm measured in tons, miles, and minutes. The rules were simple: no stopping, no overtaking, no excuses. Within a week, the Red Ball Express had become the largest continuous motor operation in human history. Every 5 minutes, a new convoy left Saint-Lô or Cherbourg. Each carried roughly 300 tons, rations, ammunition, fuel, spare parts, everything the armies at the front needed to keep fighting. Trucks followed one another at exact 60-second intervals, moving like links in a chain stretched taut across France. Military police lined the route every few miles with stopwatches and pistols. Drivers who slowed were ordered off the road. Those who broke down were pushed into ditches and stripped for parts before their engines cooled. The road had its own law, one MP later said. If you stopped, you disappeared. The system grew with frightening precision. Engineers built refueling stations every 25 miles, maintenance depots every 50. They operated around the clock, welding under floodlights, swapping out engines in less than an hour. A mechanic could replace a transmission faster than a gun crew could reload. From the air, Allied reconnaissance pilots reported a glittering stream of metal stretching from Avranches to Paris. At night, headlights traced a single line of white fire through the French countryside, visible from 20 miles away. To the Germans watching from hilltops east of Le Mans, it seemed impossible. A reconnaissance report from the 21st Panzer Division read, "Columns move day and night without pause." They do not conceal themselves. Even from the air, the Luftwaffe tried once to disrupt the flow. 5 fighter bombers strafed Route N-24B near Chartres. They destroyed 8 trucks. By nightfall, the wrecks had been bulldozed aside, and the line was moving again. The operation consumed staggering quantities of fuel, roughly 300,000 gallons each day just to move supplies, but never once did it run dry. Deep beneath the English Channel, Operation Pluto had come online. Twin pipelines pumping 1 million gallons daily into storage tanks in Normandy. It was the hidden artery behind the arteries. Quartermaster officers called it a supply line within a supply line. For the men behind the wheels, the war became a blur of vibration and noise. They lived on coffee, cigarettes, and benzodrine tablets handed out by medics. Many drove for 20 hours at a stretch, sleeping beside their trucks during brief halts. One driver, Private Samuel Collins, later recalled, "You didn't count the miles. You counted the days since you'd last stopped seeing the road. The convoys drew crowds wherever they passed. In Paris, newly liberated only days before, civilians lined the boulevards as trucks rumbled through, mud-splattered, roaring, draped with unit markings and slogans like Detroit to Berlin Express. Children waved and chased after them, collecting empty jerry cans as souvenirs. The sight of endless American transport became its own propaganda. "The Germans may still fight," wrote a French journalist that week, "but they have already lost to what moves." Inside German headquarters, disbelief turned to dread. Field Marshal Model called it civilization in motion. Reports showed the Americans wasting fuel, abandoning vehicles, even cannibalizing parts in open daylight. And still, their pace only increased. No calculation in the German playbook could account for an army that treated the laws of logistics as optional. By the second week of September, the Red Ball Express was more than a convoy system. It was a self-sustaining city on wheels. Mechanics, MPS, medics, and drivers all functioned as parts of one living mechanism. It produced motion the way a factory produces steel. German observers finally gave it a name, Die Rollende Fabrik, the rolling factory, and it was still accelerating. By mid-September, the miracle had begun to show its cost. The Red Ball Express had outrun its own legend. Drivers were collapsing at the wheel. Maintenance crews were stripping wrecks for parts faster than new trucks could arrive, and the roads themselves were disintegrating under steel. From Le Mans to Verdun, every village square was black with tire dust. Mechanics called it the season of noise. Bridges sagged from the constant weight. Engineers laid Bailey trusses over medieval spans and threw gravel over mud, just long enough for another column to pass. At Chartres, the cobblestones had been ground smooth as glass by the traffic, At Sens, the gutters ran black with oil. French farmers joked that the Americans had paved France not with concrete, but with gasoline. Inside the trucks, men slept in fragments. They drove until the lines on the road started to move, then switched with the man beside them, trading the wheel without stopping. Private Joe Hudson of the 3920 Truck Company remembered seeing phantom trucks at night, headlights that weren't there. Another driver, Calvin Jones, crashed through a barn wall after 48 hours awake, climbed out unhurt, and kept driving. At the front, Patton's army was pressing against Metz, and the limits of supply were becoming visible. Every bridge destroyed by retreating Germans had to be rebuilt under fire. Engineers of the 1303rd General Service Regiment worked knee-deep in the Moselle, guiding pontoons with ropes as shells whined overhead. They finished one bridge in 14 hours. Convoys crossed before the paint on the warning signs had dried. Behind them, rail repair crews were moving just as fast. The Transportation Corps reopened 300 miles of French track in 3 weeks, sending ammunition trains as far as Reims. The plan was to shift the burden off the highways. But the roads refused to rest. The trucks had created their own economy, fuel for trucks that hauled fuel, spare parts hauled by other spare parts. A self-feeding beast, one quartermaster officer called it. To the Germans, the scale no longer inspired disbelief, but despair. Reports from Army Group G described American depots as cities of barrels and crates. Prisoners captured near Nancy spoke of roads alive with vehicles, and of tanks that never stopped moving. A colonel from the 11th Panzer admitted under interrogation, "We can destroy bridges, but they build more trucks." In the rear, French civilians watched the flow with a mixture of awe and fatigue. Towns along the corridor never slept. Headlights passed through like tides. Some villagers began painting signs for directions, to Paris, to Verdun, to help the endless foreign drivers who no longer knew where they were, only where they were going. Children collected discarded ration tins, flattening them into toys. By the 3rd week of September, the Red Ball had carried over 250,000 tons since its creation, but the figure meant little compared to the feeling on the ground. The system had become too vast to visualize, an organism stretching from the beaches of Normandy to the edge of Germany. Soldiers started calling it the river that runs on fire. When the first autumn rains came, the sound changed. Tires hissed instead of thundered. The convoys slowed but never stopped. The road, patched and bleeding oil, seemed to breathe in rhythm with the war itself, an artery feeding a body that refused to die. By late September, the Red Ball Express was no longer a stopgap. It was the skeleton of an empire. What had begun as an improvisation to feed Patton's spearhead had become the architecture of the Allied advance. Railways, pipelines, air corridors, and truck convoys fused into a single machine designed to do one thing: keep moving east. The turning point came at Reims. Engineers of the advance section, Comzid, carved new depots out of the bombed railway yards, welding together prefabricated steel hangars in 48 hours. Each one stored 2,000 tons of supplies, rations, fuel, and shells. Forklifts and cranes operated day and night under floodlights, lifting pallets straight from trains into waiting trucks. A young ordnance officer described it in his report as a factory that manufactures distance. The air joined the network next. IX Troop Carrier Command began flying C-47 Skytrains loaded with ammunition and medical supplies to forward strips outside Verdun and Nancy. In the first week, they logged 900 sorties, delivering more tonnage than the Luftwaffe had managed in its entire Stalingrad airlift. The operation earned a new code name, White Ball, and the lines on the map multiplied. By the end of the month, supply roads crisscrossed France like circuitry. Red ball, white ball, green diamond, lion blue. Each color marked a one-way artery feeding a different army group. The Americans had turned half of France into a living logistics map. French civilians joked that the invaders had conquered not with tanks, but with traffic. But the price of momentum was human. The roads were killing men faster than some battlefields. Quartermaster reports from September 27th listed 10 drivers dead and 60 injured in a single night, most from fatigue. Trucks flipped into ditches, caught fire, or collided head-on when headlights failed. "We didn't count casualties," recalled Sergeant Robert Lewis of the 3917 Truck Company. "We counted loads." Mechanics at roadside depots worked in shifts so long they forgot what day it was. They welded by the light of burning tires, breathing in smoke and rubber dust. Yet the repairs kept pace. Replacement trucks came from Cherbourg in steady waves, assembled by ordnance battalions within hours of unloading. A system built on exhaustion somehow refused to collapse. Strategically, it changed everything. Patton's Third Army could fire at will. In the assault on Metz, artillery batteries consumed 1,000 tons of shells per day, unrestricted by rationing for the first time in the war. German positions, cut off from fuel and ammunition, were reduced one by one. The Wehrmacht still fought with skill and ferocity, but it was fighting an enemy that had learned to move faster than hunger. The psychological impact was immense. French villagers who had once cheered liberation now stared in stunned silence at the endless flow of material. German POWs, marched west in the opposite direction, were forced to watch it too. One captured lieutenant from the 11th Panzer Division told his interrogators, "You do not fight an army like this. You endure it until it rolls past." By September 30th, the Red Ball Express had delivered over 400,000 tons of cargo. Eisenhower's headquarters calculated that the convoys consumed more gasoline in a single day than the entire German Western Front received in a month. The imbalance was no longer military, it was civilizational. The final reports of that month contained no fanfare, only understatement. "All operations normal," one entry read. But the truth was visible in every direction. Bridges rebuilt overnight, rails humming again, skies full of transport planes, and an army whose heartbeat could be measured in revolutions per minute. For the first time in history, logistics had become strategy, and the road itself, the rumbling, endless road, had become the front line. October arrived with rain. For the first time since Normandy, the Red Ball Express slowed, not because of the enemy, but because of the earth itself. The roads that had carried 500,000 tons of fuel and ammunition were now dissolving into sludge. Tires sank to their rims. Convoys crept forward in low gear, engines growling like trapped animals. Every truck that reached the front carried a second cargo, mud. It filled wheel wells, caked radiators, and sloshed onto dashboards. Mechanics at Reims joked that they were hauling France east by the ton. But there was nothing funny about what the weather did to the schedule. In the first week of October, average speed dropped from 35 miles per hour to 18. Bridges washed out, roadside depots flooded, and supply columns stretched for miles behind stalled convoys. General John C.H. Lee refused to let the system collapse. He ordered the construction of 40 new bypass roads and deployed engineer battalions to rebuild bridges overnight. A destroyed span at Montereau was replaced by a Bailey Bridge in 14 hours. Another near Chalon-sur-Marne was rebuilt 3 times in 1 week. The Red Ball didn't pause. It adapted. If a bridge failed, they crossed the riverbed, one report noted. If the road failed, they made a new one. Inside the cabs, life blurred into endurance. Drivers wore gloves, slick with grease and rain, gripping the wheel until their fingers locked. When brakes froze, they kicked them loose with their boots. When radiators burst, they tied them off with rags and kept going. Private James McNair, 3918 Truck Company, recalled a night run through hail. Couldn't see the road. Just followed the tail light in front of me. When it disappeared, I hit the ditch and waited till morning. Medical logs from the 3rd Army Surgeon's Office listed dozens hospitalized each week for frostbite, trench foot, and exhaustion. Benzodrine pills, once an emergency measure, became standard issue. Yet even at its slowest, the Red Ball still delivered over 10,000 tons per day. The machine limped, but it never stopped breathing. German intelligence noticed. Reports from Army Group G, dated October 7th, read, "Enemy roads impassable, yet traffic unchanged. They drive through rivers." Field Marshal Model summarized it better in his notebook. "They fight the land as we fight them." Fuel remained the artery that kept the war alive. With Operation Pluto now reaching the Seine, American depots could draw directly from coastal reserves without waiting for tanker convoys. The pipeline pushed 1.5 million gallons per day into Normandy, where it was distributed by 700 tanker trucks across France. At Verdun, engineers installed collapsible fuel bladders, each capable of holding 3,000 gallons, and refueled entire convoys in minutes. Behind the front, maintenance depots looked more like graveyards. Stripped engines lay in rows beside piles of shredded tires. Yet the flow of replacements from Cherbourg and Antwerp made the losses irrelevant. Every destroyed truck was replaced within days. The supply line had become a living organism that shed parts and regenerated faster than it was damaged. For the men watching from the German side, the sight carried a terrible inevitability. "We destroyed 2 bridges at Etah," one engineer officer later recalled, "and the next morning the Americans were already crossing. We thought they had endless engineers. Now I think they had endless belief. By the end of October, the weather had changed everything, and nothing. Convoys rolled through sleet and fog. Headlights shimmered across puddled roads. Men were exhausted, trucks were dying, and the front had bogged down against the Siegfried Line. But the sound of engines never stopped. When asked how the Red Ball endured it, a quartermaster captain put it simply, "You don't fight the rain, you drive through it." By November, the Red Ball Express had been running for 10 straight weeks. The front had slowed to a crawl against the Siegfried Line, but the convoys did not. They had outlasted summer, outdriven the rains, and now they faced the cold. Frost formed inside windshields, radiators cracked overnight, oil turned to sludge before dawn. Yet before the sun rose, thousands of engines coughed back to life. The war had entered a different rhythm. The thunder of August had become a hum, a constant, steady drone that filled the valleys of France and Belgium. Trucks moved slower, but they moved. At Reims, quartermasters logged 11,000 tons daily, even as snow and fog turned visibility to nothing. Convoy spacing shrank to 50 yards. Drivers followed the dim glow of taillights through the mist, praying the one ahead didn't vanish into a ditch. By mid-month, the road had begun to change shape. The army called it rationalization. To the men, it meant permanence. Temporary depots were paved over, tents replaced with Quonset huts, and the once improvised routes became a grid of fixed highways feeding 1st, 3rd, and 9th Army. The Red Ball name was officially retired on November 16th, replaced by coded routes like XYZ Convoy and Green Diamond, but to the drivers, nothing changed. They could call it anything they wanted, wrote Private Henry Williams, 3908 Truck Company. It was still the same road. The air war had moved east, leaving the highways to the cold and the mud. With the Luftwaffe gone, the only enemy left was winter. Snow froze brakes and split fuel lines. Convoys slid across black ice into ditches, where engineers winched them out and sent them forward again. Drivers wore gloves, stiff with frost, leaning close to heaters that barely worked. Some trucks ran for days without shutting off their engines. Once stopped, they might never start again. Fuel discipline grew stricter. Operation Pluto had extended its lines to Antwerp and Rouen, feeding 2 million gallons per day into storage depots. From there, tanker trucks carried it to roadside bladders, giant canvas stomachs filled with gasoline that bulged beside the snowbanks. The Red Ball's arteries now stretched across 3 countries. German intelligence misread the slowing tempo as collapse. A Heeresgruppe B report from November 5th declared enemy transport inactive due to weather. But reconnaissance 10 days later showed convoys still crawling east, headlights muted, engines muffled under tarps. Inactive, one Allied officer joked, except for 5,000 trucks. For the men inside those trucks, time dissolved into motion. They learned to measure days by landmarks, the frozen canal at Liège, the steeple at Namur, the fuel dump outside Luxembourg. Private James McNair recorded one run in his logbook, 22 hours driving. Ice everywhere. 2 trucks gone off cliffs. We kept rolling. The war's front line had become a logistics line. General Eisenhower visited a convoy outside Verdun that month, stepping into the freezing wind to speak with the drivers. He told his aide later, "These men are winning the war as surely as any rifleman." His words never reached most of them. By the time his report circulated, they were already back on the road. By late November, the snow thickened. Trucks rolled with chains on their tires and frost on their mirrors. The sound was different now. Not a roar, but a growl. The drivers called it the road breathing. When one truck went off the edge, the line simply closed around it, like water around a stone. On November 30th, the official logs closed. 82 days continuous operation, one clerk wrote. 122 million ton-miles. Mission completed. But in the valleys of Ardennes, where frost clung to the burned-out villages, the rumble still echoed through the night. The engines had outlasted their orders. The first shells of the Ardennes offensive fell before dawn on December 16th, 1944. For the drivers of the Red Ball Express, now scattered across France and Belgium, it was the first time in months that they heard the front moving backward. Rumors spread faster than orders. German armor in the snow, bridges gone, roads cut. Convoys that had spent weeks hauling fuel to the edge of Germany were suddenly ordered to turn around and haul it back. In the first 48 hours, chaos reigned. Fuel depots near Saint-Vith and Bastogne were evacuated under fire. Truck columns reversed course in the dark, headlights off, guided by MPs holding lanterns wrapped in blue cloth. The same roads that had once carried victory now became escape routes. Lieutenant Donald Colwell, Advanced Section HQ, wrote in his field log, "No front, no rear, just movement in both directions." But within days the machine remembered what it was built for. General John C.H. Lee activated Operation Red Lion, a network of emergency routes feeding Third Army as it pivoted north to relieve Bastogne. Nearly 2,500 trucks were diverted from other corridors and loaded with gasoline, rations, and artillery shells. Quartermaster logs from December 20th to 26th record convoys averaging 350,000 gallons per day, much of it driven through snowstorms that erased the roads entirely. Private Charles Rivers, 3916 Truck Company, left a single entry in his logbook that week. Verdun to Bastogne, 40 trucks, gasoline. 22 hours driving, 7 off-road, delivered 200 tons, 1 frostbite. The handwriting ended mid-page. The next line simply read, complete. Fuel decided everything. Patton's armoured divisions, cut off, encircled, and moving through ice, burned more gasoline than any army in Europe had ever consumed in winter. The same deuce-and-a-halfs that had thundered through summer dust now crept through snowdrifts up to their wheel wells. Men wrapped rags around their boots, slapped frost from their faces, and kept going. The trucks ran on fear, one driver said later, ours and theirs. For the Germans it was the final illusion of advantage. The 5th Panzer Army advanced until its tanks ran dry. Fuel dumps captured in the first rush were empty, drained days earlier by Allied engineers. Prisoners taken near Clairvaux told interrogators, "We waited for gasoline that never came. Your trucks never stop." By Christmas, the convoys were rolling into Bastogne. 3rd Army's radio log for December 24th recorded 12,000 tons delivered in a single day, enough to refuel 2 armoured corps and supply the besieged 101st Airborne. To reach them, the trucks drove through shell fire. One column of the 3,919th Truck Company was hit outside Arlen. 5 vehicles burned, the rest pushed through the flames. Sergeant Robert Lewis later said, "We drove with the doors open in case we had to jump." When the weather cleared, C-47s joined the effort from above, dropping rations and ammunition on frozen fields. The Red Ball convoys carried the rest. Together, they turned the tide of the last German offensive in the West. By January 1st, 1945, the front had stabilized. The trucks that had delivered victory in summer had now delivered survival in winter. A ComZ officer summed it up in his report. Same engines, new war. The men didn't see it that way. They just knew the road had fought back and won. By March 1945, the sound of engines had become the sound of victory. The Red Ball Express, though no longer called that officially, was now a web of steel that reached into Germany itself. The convoys that once crawled through French mud were crossing the Rhine, hauling fuel and bridge parts into the heart of the Reich. The Rhine had been expected to hold for weeks. Instead, it lasted hours. When the 9th Armoured Division seized the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen on March 7th, the first vehicles to cross were not tanks or infantry. They were trucks. Quartermaster Command rerouted 1,700 vehicles overnight, each loaded with gasoline, ammunition, and steel for the engineers. By dawn, the crossing was a river of headlights. "We didn't invade Germany," one driver said later. "We paved our way in." Beyond the bridgehead, roads turned to ruin. Every village had been shelled, every culvert mined, every bridge destroyed by retreating German engineers. Yet the convoys pressed on. Bulldozers shoved rubble into craters. Wrecked Panther tanks were dragged aside like debris. At Bonn and Koblenz, German civilians stared in silence as the columns rolled through, engines droning, tires chewing through brick dust. The same noise that had once meant war now meant survival. Each truck that passed carried food, medicine, and the promise that the killing would end soon. The Germans who could still fight did so on empty tanks. Field Marshal Kesselring admitted after the war, "We could still shoot, but we could not move." Captured records from Army Group G showed less than 500,000 gallons of fuel for the entire Western Front that spring. The Americans were burning that much every 6 hours. The convoys themselves were changing. Supply officers had begun mixing cargo, fuel and rations in the same load to speed delivery. Drivers stopped wearing insignia, their uniforms black with oil. They slept sitting up, heads against the window glass, waking when the truck lurched forward. In April, quartermaster statistics logged 250 million total miles driven since August 1944. The average truck had outlived its design limit 3 times over. At Mainz, the Engineer Command, ETO, rebuilt 67 bridges in 14 days. At Worms, a pontoon bridge, 2,100 feet long, was laid across the Rhine in record time. The trucks were waiting before the last section was bolted down. Once again, the road had outrun the map. As the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, the convoys brought not just war, but order. Red Ball veterans found themselves hauling civilians, POWs, even refugees. Every load seemed to carry the same weight, history shifting from destruction to reconstruction. A lieutenant in the 3918 Truck Company wrote in his log, "We used to deliver death. Now we deliver everything else." In Berlin, the Reich was collapsing faster than anyone could record it. On April 20th, Hitler's birthday, American fuel dumps stood farther east than any German depot still operating. The front was no longer a line. It was a tide of motion rolling eastward, sustained by 6 months of relentless driving. Eisenhower's staff stopped calculating tonnage. They measured progress in gallons and miles. By May, the convoys were approaching the Czech border. The trucks that had begun the journey in Normandy were finishing it 800 miles away, their engines still running. Private Henry Williams wrote home, "Every bridge we cross feels like the last one." But it never is. On May 7th, the order finally came down. Cease all advance. Germany has surrendered. The drivers parked where they stood. Engines idled, then went silent. The last great road of the war had ended, not with gunfire, but with the hiss of cooling engines along the Rhine. When the fighting stopped, no one told the drivers. Orders simply changed. On May 8th, 1945, the same men who had hauled ammunition to Metz and fuel to Bastogne were now hauling flour, blankets, and medicine. The maps were redrawn, but the roads were the same. Convoys that had once fed divisions now fed cities. At Reims, Nancy, and Verdun, the trucks gathered in open fields to await reassignment. Quartermaster clerks walked among them with clipboards, recording numbers that read more like biographies than statistics. 31,400 miles, 29,870, 36,102. Engines that had run through every season idled for the last time. Out of the 5,958 vehicles that had started from Normandy, nearly 5,000 were still drivable, patched with wire, welded plate, and hope. Demobilization began quietly. General John C. H. Lee's final directive reclassified all convoys from combat supply to relief and rehabilitation. Within 2 weeks, 1,400 trucks carried food from Cherbourg to Paris. Another 900 were assigned to UNRWA, moving displaced people out of ruined towns in Belgium and Germany. Mechanics painted over the unit numbers and stenciled new ones. Ex-Red Ball. The work felt familiar. Same roads, same hours, but the silence was heavier. The radios stayed off. There was no more front to chase, only the endless movement of recovery. At night, drivers parked by fields, still littered with shell casings, lit cigarettes, and stared at the road that had ruled their lives for nearly a year. Army statisticians began to close the books. The official figures were dry. 12,193 tons delivered, 57 million gallons consumed, 122 million ton-miles logged, 23,000 drivers employed, 5,000 trucks lost. But behind each line was a person who hadn't stopped driving since August. No medals marked their service. There was no campaign ribbon for logistics, Most were gone by summer. The majority of drivers were African American soldiers, segregated even in victory. Some returned home to find the same barriers waiting for them. Others stayed in Europe, working civilian transport contracts or helping rebuild French and Belgian freight companies. A few formed their own. Veterans of the Red Ball would later found dozens of post-war carriers, small at first, then growing into the bones of the modern trucking industry. The discipline, the relay driving, the one-way road, they had all been born in France. In the ruins they left behind, Europe rebuilt around their roots. The makeshift depots became freight yards. The cratered highways were resurfaced and folded into national road networks. When the last Red Ball trucks were sold to local hauliers, their olive-drab paint was stripped away, but traces of the white circle still showed beneath, the ghost of the system that had held an army together. Historians came later, measuring what the drivers never could, that logistics, for the first time, had replaced maneuver as the heart of modern war. The Red Ball Express wasn't celebrated because it never paused long enough to be seen. It simply worked, day after day, truck after truck, until there was nothing left to deliver but peace. In 1994, 50 years later, the U.S. Postal Service issued a stamp with a GMC CCKW climbing a rain-slick road under the words, "Red Ball Express." A few surviving drivers stood in line to see it unveiled. One, when asked by a reporter what he remembered most, didn't hesitate. "The sound," he said. "Engines all night. When they stopped, you knew it was over."